From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
2 weeks till Election Day, with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris both making their pitches to Latino voters today, while high-profile surrogates joined the tickets in a blitz of the swing states.
We'll have more on the specific voter demographics being targeted, with Jotaka Eaddy of Full Circle Strategies, and a look at the candidates' economic messaging with Tamny of Real Clear Markets.
Plus, Secretary of State Antony Blinken meets Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel as the FBI investigates a leak of classified documents detailing Israel's plans to retaliate against Iran. Congressman Krishnamurthi of Illinois, member of the House Intelligence Committee, joins us this hour. So, Joe, of course, at this hour, we are awaiting a few interviews from Kamala Harris. She'll be sitting down with NBC as well as Telemundo after Donald Trump held a Latino-focused roundtable in Florida today, while their counterparts on the tickets were elsewhere. Tim Walz just campaigning with Barack Obama in Wisconsin.
The swing state of Wisconsin, and not by accident, joining the list of states with early voting today. Let's hear from the former president from a short time ago.
So, Wisconsin, we do not need to see what an older, loonier Donald Trump looks like with no guardrails. America's ready to turn the page. We are ready for a better story, Wisconsin. We are ready for a President Kamala Harris.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari. So, Jonathan, as we focus on Wisconsin beginning early voting today, it's already begun in a number of these battleground states, and the turnout numbers are pretty incredible. They're setting records in states like Georgia. North Carolina has already had 1 million people voting early. So what's the point of closing arguments with 2 weeks to go when so many people have already voted?
Well, the people who are voting are the folks. If you're voting early, it means you're a pretty engaged voter. You know who you're voting for. Those people probably knew who they were voting for 2 to 3 months ago. The point right now is to reach those disengaged voters who are the few people left in America who haven't decided who they want for president. These are folks who, if you're undecided at this stage, you're not really engaged with the political process. And so the two parties are just turning over every rock to try to get those folks out.
Well, it's pretty remarkable as we try to read the tea leaves here a little bit. Your home state of Pennsylvania is important because you can actually track voter registration by party as they drop ballots. So far, over 630 Democrats have voted in Pennsylvania. 300,000 Republicans have dropped ballots. This follows a pattern that a lot of people saw going into this election, doesn't it? 2-1 for Democrats.
It is 2-1 for Democrats, although it's probably a bit of an improvement for Republicans who have been discouraged by Donald Trump from using mail voting. And the advantage, a vote is a vote no matter when it's counted. But the advantage of these mail ballots is that these votes are counted. It's one less door the campaigns have to knock, and it's one less thing that might, if a person has a flat tire or an emergency on Election Day and they don't make it to the polls, their votes are already in there. So both parties really want to bank these votes as much as possible.
And that doesn't just go for the presidential race, but other races as well, including the Senate race, in which Republican Dave McCormick is challenging the incumbent, Senator Bob Casey. And McCormick is running this new ad across the state.
The United States Military Academy, West Point. It gave me the code I live by: duty, honor, country. I'm Dave McCormick. Our country is stuck, and we've got to make a change. Bob Casey's had 18 years, and he's never made a difference.
And according to the Cook Political Report yesterday, who initially thought this would be Lean's Casey, this race is now a toss-up. Jonathan, do you buy it?
I do buy it, and I think it's partly because things have tightened so much within Pennsylvania from the top of the ticket on down. Bob Casey, as the ad makes reference to, is a name. His name goes back not just his own tenure. His father was the governor there, so there's been a Bob Casey getting elected in Pennsylvania for 40 years now. But it's tight, and the longer that someone is in office, the more you get associated with a certain party, and you're less known as kind of the moderate Democrat that he was once seen. He's seen more as a member of the party. And so this is the toughest challenge he has faced. Casey has admitted it himself. it looks like it's going to be very close, just like the presidential race is going to be very close.
All eyes on Pennsylvania with the help of Bloomberg government's Jonathan Tamari. Jonathan, thank you so much for the insights. The FBI, meantime, is now investigating the leak over the weekend we told you about of classified documents that detailed some of Israel's planned response to Iran's attack from earlier this month. At his roundtable that Kaylee mentioned with Latino voters earlier today in Florida, Donald Trump made note.
They leaked all the information about the way that Israel's going to fight and how they're going to fight and where they're going to go. And somebody, who did that? Can you imagine somebody doing that? That's the enemy. I guess that maybe is the enemy from within, as I talk about.
Another reference to the enemy within as we turn to Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko. For more on this, Michelle, thanks for being with us. The FBI investigation kind of heightens the urgency around this whole story. I don't know how much we're going to learn over the course of this campaign, but could this be slowing down Israel's response as it repositions, having been exposed to some extent here with satellite imagery?
Well, it's unclear. That's certainly a threat here. I think we can start with one glimmer of hope is that contrary to kind of the characterization you heard from Donald Trump, that it is relatively limited information that was exposed. So we all kind of are still in the dark as to how Israel and when Israel will respond, even though President Biden says he knows that already and is not sharing, obviously, for obvious reasons. But it does undercut, some key arguments, including political arguments, in terms of U.S. intelligence agencies being organized and having things under wraps as they normally should be, as well as kind of an institutional issue. I mean, this comes as we're also dealing with, of course, a lot of questions around the Secret Service and are they well funded? Are they organized well enough? And all of those arguments, fair or not, are falling in Trump's favor as he kind of continues to try to portray this administration as being kind of loosey-goosey, not able to control itself. Now, what we know also that the U.S. intelligence officials have said is that they don't believe this was a foreign adversary at work here. So it is something that perhaps is from within, however you want to characterize that. Yeah. And it follows on the heels of, several other similar incidents in recent years, including last year, you might remember the National Guardsman who leaked information on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So not helpful, also makes a pretty awkward moment between U.S. and Israel at this point.
Well, and speaking of, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel. He met today with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And according to the State Department's readout of that meeting, they talked about new possibilities for ending the conflict in Gaza after Israel's successful killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Are we getting actually closer to a ceasefire, or is this more optimistic talk as we've seen in the past?
It's hard to say. I mean, it looks like this trip is starting out for Blinken as just as painstaking as the previous 10 to the region for him. I mean, we talked about that meeting earlier. It looks like, yes, they have agreed that there is some, opportunity here out of Sinwar's death, but it's worth noting that each probably sees that opportunity a little differently. Israel seeing an opportunity to continue momentum in their attacks and on both fronts and kind of continue and try to finish off the war in a military sense. Whereas the U.S. is kind of coming at it, especially from Secretary Blinken, from an angle of let's see if we can get some ceasefires going, and ceasefires plural, not just in Gaza, but also now on the Lebanon front. That looks increasingly elusive at this point. Both fronts are very live, as we've seen, and are still very active. And this is all, of course, awaiting that retaliation on Iran that we're expecting any day now.
All right, Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, thank you so much. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at Donald Trump and Kamala Harris's economic plans with John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets and president of the Parkview Institute. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I think fair trade is a key boost for growth, for employment, for innovation, for productivity. And I would say that it's something that we should not throw away, because in any period of time where this country, the United States, has thrived, were periods of trade.
Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, earlier today on Bloomberg when asked a question about Donald Trump and tariff policy. Joining us now for more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets and president of the Parkview Institute, as well as co-author of Bringing Adam Smith into the American Home, a case against home ownership. He's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I think you're a free trade guy, so you probably are leaning more toward the argument of Christine Lagarde than Donald Trump, I would imagine. What is missing in this trade narrative in this election cycle? Because Kamala Harris isn't necessarily disavowing tariffs either. This administration has left a lot of the Trump tariffs in place.
No, both sides seem to want to maintain this, and it's a disappointment. It cannot be stressed enough that work divided is the greatest productivity enhancer, greatest thing for the worker worldwide that the world has ever known. I'll add that it's also the greatest foreign policy that mankind has ever known, simply because when we are trading together, when the world is our customer and when the world is also selling to us, the incentive to bomb, to shoot guns is greatly reduced. And so it would be great if both sides could talk, instead of talking politically, talk economically and point out how good this is for all concerned.
And maybe speak to debt and deficits while they're at it. I wonder your thoughts on what we've heard from the Trump camp on extending tax cuts and some of the tax proposals from Kamala Harris, because the independent analysis is it's just a question of which candidate adds more or less to the deficit without explaining how to pay for all these ideas. Are we about to enter a new era of even higher deficits?
Well, it may surprise you that my view is that the biggest driver of deficits is, in fact, rising revenues. Think about what kind of credit card you could get out of college compared to now. As your income grows, the more you're able to borrow. Think of any corporation. When they're small, when they're startups, they can't borrow at all. When they grow and they become public companies, they can borrow with ease. Borrowing is a function of an expectation.
You're assuming Congress sticks to a budget, though.
They don't have to. And the reason why is they've got access to the income of the most productive people on earth, the American people. And so it strikes me that this is one area where Harris and Trump are talking very responsibly. Anytime you can limit the flow of dollars to Washington, that's actually a market signal that we're we're more of a borrowing risk. You want to limit the flow of dollars so that they'll lend to us less. The reason the world is so eager to line up to us is because Americans are so heavily taxed on work that is, again, the most productive on earth.
But the tax does go to paying for programs like, say, Medicare or Social Security. Entitlements are the biggest part of expenditures, right? The government has no choice but to pay those.
And that's why I always say, probably if you're like me and you think that a lot of government programs are wasteful,
someone needs to be talking about Social Security then when they're not.
No, I think actually the argument for keeping Social Security as is and keeping Medicare as is that precisely because they gobble up so much of the budget, that means there's less room for Washington to maneuver in creating new big programs. The beauty of them now is they limit the ability of politicians to invent new ways to basically perpetuate their existence, to grow new programs, to invent new ideas.
But then Congress will show up and completely overspend and exacerbate the problem, right? This is a vicious cycle that we have found ourselves in. You can cut taxes all you want, but who says spending is going to go down?
Yeah, well, politicians exist to spend, and this is precisely my point. We keep talking about, from the left, we get higher taxes. From the right, we get spending cuts. From supply-siders, they say, don't worry, both of you, if we cut taxes, we'll get you more revenues. None of the three ideologies, religions, whatever you want to call it, are making the crucial point that we have a problem of too much tax revenue coming in now and the expectation of exponentially more in the future. That's why debt continues to rise, but interest rates on that debt continue to fall. Never forget that in 1980, total federal debt was $900 billion, yet the interest rate on the 10-year then was 11%. Yeah. Fast forward 40-some years, we have debt of $35 trillion. Yet the yield on the 10-year is somewhere in the 3 to 4% range. What does that tell you? That's the market saying that they're more comfortable with the federal debt now than they were back in 1980. And why is that? Because they know that revenues into the government will continue to grow.
Well, if we talk about interest rates, that does lead us to the housing situation in America. As we mentioned, you've written an entire book about this. We've seen both candidates talking about housing. Kamala Harris especially putting forward a lot of policy ideas on providing down payment assistance, incentives to increase housing supply. What do you make of some of those policy suggestions?
What an odd way of trying to bring down the price of anything is my answer. And this is important because look at where we're on a show that's focused on Wall Street and on finance. And so if you look, what is the history of Wall Street? It's about financing companies that bring down the price of anything. Let's not forget that in the 1970s, AT&T had 100% of the long-distance market. But thanks to Wall Street putting money behind companies like MCI and eventually smartphones, it's nowadays that we can have long-distance calls around the world for next to nothing. Look at what is Amazon, what is Apple, what are these companies, what is Google? They are ways for us to communicate, for us to shop with the world at prices that continue to drop. And so it strikes me that we have our answer for cheaper housing. And it comes from Wall Street. It's companies, it's private equity firms like Blackstone aggressively buying up houses and looking for ways to rent to people in neighborhoods that they otherwise couldn't afford. That frees people from having to own something that they don't really understand, from having to maintain something they don't really understand. But Wall Street is going to be the solution, I think, to bringing down the price of housing that concerns so many. Government can't do that. Government has no resources to bring down prices. Only innovation can do that. And I think we're seeing it from Wall Street.
Just to put a finer point on it, though, what happens to housing prices if you give $25,000 to over 1 million prospective home buyers?
You would guess that you'd probably get 25 houses that are $25,000 more. The idea that you can subsidize a lower cost by giving people more money is at odds with just basic economics.
Nice to have you. Great.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate your being with us. John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, president of the Parkview Institute, with us on Balance of Power. As we take a look now and turn to some of the voter segments that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are targeting. As we've been discussing earlier today, we talked with Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino, what she had to say about the candidate's appeal to minority voters.
The biggest potential that both candidates have is like, how do you mobilize the young voter in the African-American community, young voter in the Latino community? Because it was the young voter in Arizona and in Nevada in 2022 that basically secured a Democratic Senate, because they were the last ones to vote. They were low propensity information voters. And so with less than 20 days out, now's the time to really for the candidates to talk to these voters specifically about the issues and try to break through that noise.
Let's have the voice now of Jotaka Eaddy, founder and CEO of Full Circle Strategies. Jotaka, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. This has really become the closing argument in many ways, the fight over the young voter here. And it's fascinating to watch the different ways that these two candidates are going after. I think what we can argue is the most elusive and most difficult to motivate of really any voting bloc. Not that the young voter is a monolith here. They're both going after their own demographics. Who's winning?
I believe that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are winning. When we look at the momentum and the energy around this country, it is just undeniable. I think it's a critical time, as we just heard previously, in the country right now. And I believe that the campaign and also just everyday Americans understand what is at stake. And I think that's what we're seeing, the response. We're seeing record numbers of voter turnout. Early voting numbers are at very high levels right now. And I think that's an indication of the excitement and momentum that is happening in this country.
Well, as we consider where we're seeing the momentum, certainly we have seen a tick up in enthusiasm for Kamala Harris's candidacy with black voters compared to where Joe Biden was. Yet she is not, and I mean Joe Biden this cycle, she's not yet at the levels we saw in 2020. It seems black women are one thing, black men are another, Jotaka. And I wonder what you make of the difference we are seeing in the gender gap, which is true at a national level in this election across all demographics and races, but in black voters specifically.
I mean, I think when we look at black voters as a whole, I think it's important for us to really be careful about this narrative that continues to pit black men and black women against each other. Black men are second to black women in terms of their loyalty to the Democratic Party. And we are seeing, yes, we see there are some conversations. There are some very few voices. There are a plethora of voices of Black men who are coming out very enthusiastic for Vice President Kamala Harris. On July 22nd, there was a national Zoom call, and there were 55,000 Black men on that call. They raised $1.3 million in support of Kamala Harris, and there have been numerous other mobilizations around the country of Black men that are showing up for Vice President Kamala Harris, in particularly coming out and being very positive about her very bold agenda for Black men, in addition to the policies that have already benefited Black men from the Biden-Harris administration, and also just all of her proposals. So I do think that there is a lot of enthusiasm from Black men. I just believe mostly what we're seeing is a narrative that is being put out there to lead people to believe that there is some deep, this deep splinter with Black men, and I just don't think that's the case.
That's really interesting, Jotaka. We should let our listeners and viewers know that you started hosting these regular Zoom meetings as part of your organization, Win with Black Women, 4 years ago. And this has become quite a phenomenon. As I read in the Associated Press, you could barely log into your own meetings, gathering 44,000 people at one point. All of a sudden, Kamala Harris is at the top of the ticket, and you managed to steer this online effort into a campaign apparatus, essentially. So bring us into one of these meetings. What are we hearing that's not right about that narrative? What are young Black men telling you other than Donald Trump helped to enrich them and give them a better life?
Well, I think, first of all, on most Win with Black Women meetings, while everyone is invited, it's mostly women. There are meetings that are happening. There's a group called Win with Black Men, and they meet on a regular basis. And I think what's happening in these meetings is that, number one, everyone who's joining these conversations are making sure that they are getting all of the correct information, making sure that we are correcting and disinformation, most importantly, making sure that everyone in our communities, that we're empowering ourselves to empower our communities to make a vote plan, because that's what's really critical right now. I think also there's deep conversations about the various policies of this administration currently, and also the policies that Vice President Kamala Harris has put forth for a Harris administration. And there's a lot of excitement around that agenda, around those policies, whether it is a specific agenda for Black men, a very specific agenda for Black America, or the overall plan for all of America. Because what we have also seen is a surgence of other groups that have come together excited about this, whether it is the Swifties, whether it's cake lovers, or whether it's train enthusiasts. There has just been a plethora of communities that have come together who are now organizing to make sure that Kamala Harris is the next president of the United States, simply because they understand what is at stake. So much is at stake right now.
In addition to your work with Win with Black Women, Jotaka, you also have a deep bench of experience in Silicon Valley. You've served on the board of a number of tech startups, for example. What would you say to Silicon Valley about what they should expect out of a Kamala Harris presidency, and how it may or may not be different than the way Joe Biden has approached policy around big business and technology specifically?
Well, I would say that tech, there's a lot at stake, particularly for tech. As we know, I spent a lot of time, particularly in financial technology, understanding that government and regulation is very much a part of anything that is being built in Silicon Valley. And so having an administration that is willing to embrace Silicon Valley, to understand Silicon Valley, particularly in this AI economy and others, crypto, all of these, having a focus on helping support entrepreneurs, looking at particularly the increase from a $5,000 business credit to an increase of $25,000, $50,000 business credit for entrepreneurs. That means something, particularly in Silicon Valley. And I think also when you look at the work that Vice President Kamala Harris has already done as it relates to AI and other new innovations, it's going to be important to have a president in the White House that is going to be an open ear, a reasonable, fair president, but also a president that is going to make sure that there's respect for the United States on the world stage, because our technology, it doesn't just live here. We're competing with others across the world. And when we lose respect with other world leaders and other markets in the world, it makes it very difficult for business to thrive. And so that is why I think Silicon Valley is paying attention, and there's an excitement behind Vice President Kamala Harris with Silicon Valley when you look at all of the support that she is getting.
All right, Jotaka Eaddy, founder and CEO of Full Circle Strategies, thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, we'll talk more on geopolitics. Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, ranking member of the House China Select Committee and member of the House Intelligence Committee, is next on Bloomberg.
This may contribute to a longer period of time, this leak. The administration is clearly acknowledging that it happened, which also makes me think that there may be some effort to ensure that whatever happens is sufficiently different than whatever information was leaked.
Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, yesterday on Balance of Power on the intelligence leak involving the plans of Israel's prepared response to Iran's attack. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, member of the House Intelligence Committee and ranking member of the China Select Committee. Congressman, thanks very much for being here with us on Balance of Power. If we consider this intelligence leak, and frankly the others we have seen in recent years, as a member of the House Intel Committee, to what degree are you concerned about the protection of not just secrets pertaining to our own national security, but the security as well of allies like Israel?
Well, I'm extremely concerned, and I'm glad that the FBI initiated this investigation into determining whether this was a leak or whether this was somehow a compromise. But regardless, this should never have happened. And so going forward, we have to take whatever steps are necessary to protect this information, not only ours, but as you mentioned, those of our friends, partners, and allies.
Well, bring us inside to the extent that you can. Congressman, your viewpoint on the Intel Committee, should we expect hearings? And where will this investigation take place inside Congress?
I don't know. I'm not sure that there would be hearings. In any case, I think that it would probably be in a classified space. I'll be back on Monday, and probably one of the first things that I'll do is I'll be going through my homework book, so to speak, reading all the different wires and classified information with regard to this particular topic, as well as a number of others.
Well, and I'm sure among those other topics, it does pertain to your work on the China Select Committee as well. We have heard a lot about China on the campaign trail, frankly, from both of the candidates. Donald Trump touting tariffs as his favorite word. Kamala Harris indicating she wants to win the technology war against China, if you will, make sure we're competitive in this next century of technology. Where are you seeing a distinction between the way in which these candidates approach China? Is this entirely a level of tariffs conversation versus a question around whether tariffs or export controls are going to exist? This is just a matter of degree, right?
Well, not necessarily. I think that I think on a bipartisan basis, there's concern about the export of technology, or for that matter, investments by Americans in companies of concern in China, especially a company like Huawei, which should never have access to either high-end semiconductor manufacturing equipment or chips, for that matter. However, there's another part of this, which I think Kamala Harris has talked about as well, which is we got to improve our own competitiveness as an economy, meaning we have to make sure we invest in basic science research and development, which later gets commercialized into the latest technology of the future. But we also have to upgrade the skills of our workforce and fix our legal immigration system to attract and retain the best and the brightest people to innovate and become the entrepreneurs of the future in these technologies. So on the one hand, we have to play defense with regard to the export of technology to China and other countries, but we also have to improve our ability to innovate here in the U.S.
Congressman, we're hearing today from Taiwan Semiconductor in an interesting development here, informing the United States of a possible attempt by Huawei to circumvent export controls and actually buy some of the product coming out of Taiwan Semiconductor. Coming off of their earnings report recently, this is a company that's not only doing well, but beating and raising estimates, growing faster than investors even expected with the demand that we're getting from chips designed by the likes of NVIDIA. When you hear about a story like this, how concerned are you about the growth that this company is experiencing and, of course, the liability that it brings being in Taiwan?
Well, I'm very concerned, and we should expect the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, along with entities controlled by the CCP, including Huawei, by the way. Just so your audience knows, the reason Huawei is such a company of concern is that it is part of the mass surveillance and detention architecture that the Chinese government has erected with regard to the Uyghurs, for instance. They've engaged in various other nefarious activities over time, and that's why they are on the sanctions list. So when Huawei or other companies try to buy these chips, whether it's from TSMC, which is manufacturing for another company, or TSMC's own chips, then we're concerned about those chips being used in those very nefarious activities that American taxpayers and citizens are concerned about. So that's why we have to do everything we can to prevent our companies from inadvertently selling into clandestine front companies for Huawei and others on the entity list, or preventing TSMC from inadvertently doing the same and working with our friends, partners, and allies about their companies too.
But Congressman, to the kind of second point of Joe's question around just the geographic base of TSMC and the concern around vulnerability or exposure to Taiwan specifically, with an unknown exactly as to how China will be approaching Taiwan. How do you expect that part of the conversation to look different depending on who ends up in the White House in January?
Well, Kamala Harris has made it very clear that she wants the status quo to prevail in terms of China not initiating aggression toward Taiwan, and of course, Taiwan not making provocative moves either. Now, with regard to Donald Trump, we've heard him say some statements that are very concerning, which make it sound as though he would be less kind of exercised about hostilities initiated against Taiwan, that he would somehow send a signal that we would not be there to provide articles of self-defense or equipment or what is necessary to the Taiwanese for them to deter aggression. And that's very concerning, because when you don't build up deterrence, you are inviting aggression. That is the lesson that we've learned from history and with regard to the CCP.
Well, let's hear from Donald Trump. He actually sat down with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, last week, and had this to say when asked if he would commit, for instance, to putting American troops on the ground to defend Taiwan if it were invaded by China.
Well, the reason they're doing it now is they're not going to do it afterwards, okay? So it's, so they're doing it now. They want to do it China. Now, look, I had a very good relationship with President Xi, and a very good relationship with Putin, and a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un, who has a nuclear force that you won't even believe.
Congressman, a little hard to tell what he meant by that. He didn't exactly answer the question, but did point to his relationship with President Xi. What would a Trump 2.0 mean then for this relationship and for the future of Taiwan?
I don't know what he was talking about. I don't think he knew exactly either. He said something about how he had a great relationship with Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un, which to me is concerning in and of itself. But I'm not sure what a Trump 2.0 foreign policy would look like in that region. What I do know is that, unfortunately, our friends, partners, and allies would not be reassured by those statements that he made just now, whether it's South Korea or Japan, given his statements about Kim Jong-un, or whether it's neighbors in the region who are banding together with us, like Australia and India through the Quad, to deal with the CCP's aggression in the South China Sea, among other places. And so we have to do what it takes to reassure them, because when we reassure them, then they work together with us to establish the international rules of the road, which, again, I come back to the point, it lessens the possibility of aggression. and lessens the possibility of instability in the region.
Well, we're glad we could talk about it today. Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, thank you, sir, for your perspectives. Coming up, Barack Obama joins the campaign trail in Wisconsin with Tim Walz. And a refreshed appeal to minority voters. Our political panel joins next with more on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is a person, Donald Trump, who tried to undo a free and fair election, who still denies the will of the people, who incited a violent mob to attack the United States Capitol, and 140 law enforcement officers were attacked. Some were killed. This is a serious matter.
Vice President Kamala Harris sitting down with NBC News earlier today. We're getting some excerpts now as she talks about her opponent, of course, and the events of January 6th. Joining us now this evening's political panel, Sarah Chamberlain is with us, President and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist, along with Pat Dennis, President of American Bridge, 21st Century Democratic strategist. Great to see you both here back at the table. Pat, are you getting worried that Kamala Harris is spending more time talking about Donald Trump than Kamala Harris?
I think it's important to talk about Donald Trump. Nobody in this race is going to forget that Donald Trump exists. And he's dangerous. He took away the right to abortion. He wants to take away health care. He wants to, do damage to the solvency of Social Security. These are really important things. Now, she has a positive vision. She also talks about that for sure. But in no world are we going to forget about Donald Trump here.
Well, and if Donald Trump is shaping up to be what it seems to be a key part of Harris's closing argument here, Sarah, what's Donald Trump's closing argument?
Well, if I was advising Donald Trump, I would advise him to lay out Kamala Harris and who she is and the fact that she's really liberal. Yes. And kind of let the voters know really who she is. I mean, she really is left, and she's California. So, I mean, it is what it is. She's trying to move to the middle, but she's got a lot of positions that are far left.
This is against the backdrop of a 2-week span now, 2 weeks from today. Ugh. And both campaigns, you can't wait.
I can't wait.
Both campaigns have found demographics that are weak spots that they are appealing to. In many cases, they are young males, young minority male voters. This is why Barack Obama's on stage with Tim Walz today in Wisconsin, where early voting is beginning. Donald Trump has had his own angle and, in fact, was doing a pretty good job eating into that demographic when he was running against Joe Biden. This is also a very difficult group to measure. How do you view this snapshot right now where we are?
Yeah, and as we get closer to Election Day, everybody wants to slice and dice the electorate finer and finer, narrow. And it gets real hard to measure it as you get in there. What I would say is the most important thing is you need a top-line message that appeals to everybody across, race and class and everything. And I think Kamala Harris has that about the opportunity economy, bringing prices down. That's super important. Now, you need to tailor that message sometimes to talk to the other groups, and Barack Obama, incredible communicator at that. So deploying him, I think, is really smart.
Is the best person to deploy for this group for Donald Trump, Sarah, Donald Trump himself? He's been doing all of these podcasts. He's going to be on with Joe Rogan on Friday. Is he doing all of the outreach on his own?
He is, because he doesn't want anybody else to do it with him. I mean, that's pretty obvious.
What's the role of J.D. Vance here first?
A little bit J.D. Vance. Obviously, he's doing it. But Donald Trump wants to be the closer. He always has been. We've all watched his show many times. So he wants to close. Hopefully, he will stay on message and close with a good message. And he won't be off script, as he has been in the last few days.
Well, let's hear what we heard maybe on the script in Wisconsin earlier today. Barack Obama with this message to men supporting Donald Trump.
I've noticed this especially with some men who think Trump's behavior is somehow a sign of strength. You never apologize for anything. You're not accountable for anything. I'm here to tell you that's not what real strength is. Never has been. Real strength's about working hard. Real strength's about taking responsibility for your actions. Real strength's about telling the truth even when it's inconvenient.
A good point here and a good moment in the rally, Sarah, but the fact is for Donald Trump, that's working in many cases. How does Kamala Harris counter that?
She has to send Barack Obama out to do that, because what Trump is doing, they like, especially the younger men, they like his rhetoric. They like this. And remember, they have pretty much grown up with him, and they can't buy homes. You know, inflation has killed them. They're paying a lot of money in their rent. They've got college bills. So they're kind of in that COVID to Trump to inflation range. That's why Trump is able to appeal to them. And they like the tough guy. I mean, our polling shows that.
So if it's about the economy at the end of the day, do we need to be seeing more ads and more focus on the economy in the next 2 weeks rather than about abortion and Donald Trump being unfit to serve?
All these issues are completely related. You know, abortion in a lot of our focus groups is an economic issue for people. Sure. So these are all tied together. If you look at the mix of ads on TV right now, I think, you know, it's really solid about making this case across prices, across, you know, how Trump's tariff plan would decimate the economy. So I don't think if you're in a swing state, I don't think anybody is lacking for ads right now. And we just got to close this out.
Well, even in the D.C. area, I don't think we count swing states anymore.
It's just good ones if we have to watch them, Pat.
That's the goal.
Yeah. All right. Our political panel is staying with us. It's coming up. We'll look down the ballot at some of the key Senate and House races that are tightening with just 2 weeks until Election Day. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm not surprised to see the Casey-McCormick race getting closer. You know, McCormick didn't have quite the name recognition that Casey does. Casey is quite the well-known name in Pennsylvania. So not surprising that he had a big lead early on, but I think we're seeing it converge closer to where the presidential election is, and I suspect we'll see that in other states as well, where Senate candidates and the presidential race seem to be diverging.
Michael Berkman, political science professor at Penn State University, on the early edition of Balance of Power today. Back with us now on the late edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our political panel, Sarah Chamberlain and Pat Dennis. So, Sarah, if we look at a state like Pennsylvania, a swing state, yes, we care about it for the presidential, but also one that, according to the Cook Political Report, is a toss-up between Casey and McCormick. What has changed? Or is it just that the Senate races are now coming more in line with the presidential race in a way they weren't?
So I think Pennsylvania, two things has changed. McCormick is a much better candidate than Oz was. If we had run Oz 2 years ago, we would already have him in the United States Senate. And then as the race gets closer, obviously it does help the Senate candidates as well. I still think Casey will be a lift to defeat because of the family history there. But we're going to come close if we don't get it. So we're pretty excited about that.
If Bob Casey loses Pennsylvania, that means Kamala Harris did as well, right? We're moving beyond this idea of ticket splitting.
Yeah, but I don't think he's going to lose. We've expected, you know, he's had these blowout polls for months. You expect a consolidation as you come in towards Election Day. But, you know, somebody like McCormick, somebody who's from Connecticut, a similar struggle to what Oz had, not being from the state, I think ultimately, like, he hasn't been able to connect with voters there in the same level. And, I think the Senate race will end up being a lift for Harris.
Well, so if we look at kind of the map of the battleground states we're watching that polls suggest is a dead heat between Harris and Trump, it's not necessarily the case in, say, the Ruben Gallego-Kerry Lake race. Things seem to be tightening in the Slotkin and Baldwin races, for example. But which polling do you think is more reliable, the polling in the Senate races or in the presidential races? Or are we really going to end up with a Senator Gallego from Arizona at the same time Trump wins?
Well, Kerry Lake is a uniquely damaged candidate in a lot of ways. So I think what's happening in Arizona is pretty special. But I think ultimately most of this polling, like I said, it's going to continue to consolidate. But these durable leads we've seen from Democrats, I think, will hold.
Let's stick with this ticket splitting idea for just a minute. It's partly your job to have Republicans keep a majority in the House. Is it possible for that to happen even if Kamala Harris wins the White House?
It is, very much so, because we still are seeing ticket splitting out there. I know the media is talking about there isn't ticket splitting, but there is, especially with women.
So tell us.
Right, especially with women. Women are willing to ticket split. You're going to see that in North Carolina, for an example. You're going to see a Trump vote, but not the governor's vote. They're either going to ticket split or skip that entirely because he's down in like 27% approval.
So imagine this world. We'll just put together what both of you just said, Kayleigh. We're there on election night. Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Maybe we're not waiting a week in that scenario.
Well, I think we're all crossing our fingers that we don't have to.
By the grace of God, sure.
Wait a week. But I guess it raises a question. If the House majority stays, and it could be Republican Senate potentially in that scenario, I would imagine those things are not going to, the Senate's not going to say blue if the House stays red, and you get potentially a Harris presidency. What gets done in that government? What gets done if it's a red Senate and a blue House?
So if it's Harris, hopefully she's going to be willing to compromise with the House and Senate and get some things done. We have seen, under Bill Clinton, we had divided, get a lot of things done. If it's Trump, his agenda will pretty much fly through both the House and the Senate.
Get that border compromised, passed in the Senate and House?
Potentially. I mean, Donald Trump has decided to throw a wrench into any potential border solution. So would he continue to do that after losing the presidential race? We don't know. How much power will he have over the party? I think he will continue to be a problem for the party either way, but we'll see.
Well, and it also probably depends who party leadership is going to be, Sarah.
Right.
If the Republicans do not keep control of the House, what becomes of current Speaker Mike Johnson? Is he a leader in the minority?
I don't know. That's going to be up for the members to decide. There's a lot of talk about that now. Luckily, I don't get to vote on that, so I'll hear about it. I don't know how it all plays out. But if we do lose the House, it's going to be by 3 or 4 seats either way. I mean, no matter what we're looking at a very tight House, which, again, will be difficult to govern, no matter who you are.
So in that scenario, though, a couple of seats change. The fact of the matter is, Speaker Johnson has proven fundraising prowess. That was enough to do a lot for former speakers. Doesn't that keep him in a leadership position?
I would think if we keep the House, it will. I don't know about the minority. As I said, I don't get involved in those races. I let the members of the Republican Main Street Partnership do that, and I just listen.
If it's not a Mike Johnson leader, though, is he the most honest broker Democrats could hope to work with? What if it's a Jim Jordan instead or someone else?
Look, we could definitely get worse. But I wouldn't say he's a particularly honest broker. And regardless of his own preferences, that caucus has just shown itself ungovernable in many, many ways. Now, he's held on this long, but, if this gets any tighter, I don't know how he will manage to wrangle that crew.
We have 2 weeks to go. Let it wash over you. Sarah Chamberlain, Pat Dennis, thank you for a great conversation and expert analysis, as always. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter before we meet back here again tomorrow. You can find it on the terminal and online.
And we can't let things go on this Tuesday without acknowledging the birthday of the voice in our ear.
Hear, hear.
Our producer, Lindsay's birthday is today. So happy birthday, Lindsay. We'll see you on the other side tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.